Hello, and welcome to another lecture as part of Bio 4253, which is Principles of Ecology. And today we'll be going over metapopulations, a little bit of island biogeography, and I think I end with a little bit on species area relationships. And so basically, instead of focusing on a single population or a single community at a site, we're now going to consider sites that are separated by space and where species are, at least individuals within the same species, are dispersing around. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. And so I drew 4 circles. And so the readings for this week are going to be chapter 4 of Gotelli, much of which is contained in this lecture, but I think he goes over some stuff that I just didn't, but we can cover it in the other lecture, but it's a really great resource. So it's a chapter 4 of the book, Primary of Ecology, which is the chapter all about metapopulations. And then the second reading is on the equilibrium theory of island biogeography, which is available at this link here. Okay, so let's dive in. And so previously we've learned about the niche, we've learned about population dynamics at a single site, right? So when we considered exponential growth and logistic growth, it was a model of a population that was existing in one site. And we talked a little bit about dispersal, but not about how dispersal influences population dynamics of interconnected sites. And so that's what main topic of today's lecture is on. And to sort of motivate us to start thinking about the spatial context of population dynamics, I'd like to start with a description of a scientist. I think he was working for the USDA, I'm pretty sure, named Huffaker, who set up this hilarious mite experiment. And so he had these 2 species of mites, one predatory on the other. So we have predator-prey system. And these mites exist on oranges. That's their habitat. And so he set up an experiment to try to look at whether you could actually observe predator-prey cycles. And we'll get to predator-prey cycles, I think, soon, next week maybe. But also he tested, in essence, the influence of spatial processes and of habitat or landscape complexity on the ability to witness those predator-prey cycles and to have the prey refugia. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. These are oranges. This is just sort of geographic space. You could think of it as a top-level shot down. Okay, and so the prey mites and the predator mites exist on these oranges. And he set it up like this where there's space in between them, but he also considered the case where all the oranges were just grouped together. When all the oranges were grouped together, the predator excluded the prey, would just eat all the prey, and then itself would die because it had no food resources. So there's no sustained predator-prey oscillations or anything like that. It was just collapse. When the patches were further apart, like this, still saw collapse. So the predator would eat all the prey and then itself would die. And this led him down a path of so many experimental manipulations that start to get at why metapopulations are actually kind of fun and interesting. And so he replaced some of the, let's just change the color. So instead of oranges, he replaced some of them with just balls. And so they were just sort of blanks, essentially. So non-resource. He also set up fans to encourage dispersal, because the idea is if you could get the prey to disperse faster than the predator or more efficiently than the predator, then the prey could always be one step ahead spatially and could just keep moving and then did not get eaten. He also connected some of them with, I think, string in order to help with dispersal. Yeah, dispersal corridors. Orange balls replaced oranges. Oh yeah, he sealed parts of an orange with wax so that they would like. This is my wax. Oh, it's not even working. I tried to do a little spray paint tool. Yeah, to basically just limit the amount of resource that was there. And he observed, after he incorporated this insane amount of variations, all these experimental manipulations, and he observed one oscillation, so one predator-prey oscillation before it crashed. And that was, like, I guess, considered a success. But what it really shows is that spatial variation and understanding the spatial structure and then the dispersal among the patches and things like that really can influence observed persistence and observed population dynamics. So space is really important. And what essentially he was doing is setting up a metapopulation. And so I think, yeah, we defined a metapopulation here. So this is essentially a metapopulation where you have patches of habitat within a inhospitable matrix or sea of, so all this white space, it's not like the predator and prey could persist there. They needed this to sort of live on this food resource that was also their habitat. And these patches are connected by dispersal. And so if the patch is over here, it might be harder to get to from this patch than it would be to get from this patch to this patch, or vice versa. And so the orange example is like a little bit trivial, but we can think about metapopulations existing in sort of more natural settings. So rock pools, so the depressions in rocks where water comes in, can support a bunch of different species, and oftentimes they're interconnected. So I'm thinking specifically of the work of Luc de Meester, looking at that as a meta community, metapopulation, because there's more than one species there. Another more sort of classic example of metapopulation would be the glanville fritillary butterfly in the Åland Islands, which are way up north in Finland. I guess an island associated with Finland. Or a set of islands, a series of islands. I should know this. I did a postdoc in Finland. I never got a chance to go to Åland, but I worked with some of the data. And so it was a set of dry meadows where it was a habitat for a butterfly. And it was a sort of overpositioned site as well as like a breeding site where it couldn't really exist within. All right. And the thing about metapopulations that makes them interesting, there's many things that make them interesting. They're sort of rife with local extinctions. They're incredibly dynamic systems. And so over time, patches will become occupied or unoccupied. Let's see. I'll try to show this graphically. All right, so let's say we have this. This is our metapopulation. And let's say at time 1, these two patches, should I use different colors? There we go. These two patches are occupied. These patches are not occupied. And so here occupancy is just a 0-1 process. A patch is either occupied or it is unoccupied, where occupancy is typically defined as the fraction of occupied patches. And so here we have 6 patches total. 2 of them are occupied. Occupancy is 2 divided by 6, or 1/3. But this is at time 1. Let's say the next time we were to go out and sample this. I don't know why that's not that color. All right, let's do that. Now, I'm just going to move them. Okay, you get the idea. Is the two patches that were previously occupied are now unoccupied, and only this one patch is occupied. So occupancy is now dropped to 1 out of 6. And this is characteristic of metapopulations. They're constantly in a state of flux, or of where patches become occupied and then unoccupied fairly regularly. All right. Here, I briefly mentioned the concept of synchrony. I'm not sure if I want to go into that now or later, but we might as well go into it now. All right. So these metapopulations are connected via dispersal links. And so like this one becomes colonized as a function of dispersal, potentially from another colonized patch. In the next time step, this one will be the source of colonizers that are sent out to these other patches, right? And so this is a population that maybe is 50 individuals, dispersing individuals that will colonize other patches and lead to further dynamics. But some patches might be farther away. And so getting there is just going to take a little bit more time. So this patch it wouldn't necessarily be occupied as much. The concept of synchrony is when dispersal is high enough to where population dynamics between two patches become quite similar. So synchrony is just that. Let's say, this is going to be really ugly, but I'll draw it out. So this patch through time, so we have time on the x-axis and abundance on the y. Let's say this population goes like that in, oops. I'm getting there, guys. All right, it goes like that. Let's go ahead and label our axes as well while we're at it. Team Ray, we have time here, and then we have abundance on the y-axis. Synchrony occurs when the population dynamics of two unconnected sites, or I mean loosely connected through dispersal sites, have really like similar population dynamics. And so it can be lower or upper, but it would just mirror. And so that black line is this site and the population dynamics of that site over time. And the orange line corresponds to this site. These are synchronous. Why this becomes a problem? Okay, so first of all, how this happens. This happens through either shared responses to the environment or the effect of dispersal. So when dispersal is very high, the two populations will look very similar because they're both dispersing really high, and it's basically just one sort of panmictic population. And so why this is a problem is that synchronous populations will, at any given point in time, have sort of correlated abundances, which isn't a problem except when abundance becomes low. So, right, so if right here, let's say both populations have a dip in abundance, this increases the chance of extinction just as a function of demographic stochasticity. And so you can have a situation where your entire metapopulation would collapse as a function of it being synchronous. Okay, that felt like a little bit of an aside, but hopefully that you understand what I mean when we say synchrony now. And it does tie into the next section a little bit, which is if synchrony is bad, and if a metapopulation is essentially a potentially just fragmented entire population, right? So why would you want there to be independent patches, and why not just have like a big group of patches? Allow species to have a big population size and allow species to like utilize that area. So I talk about the benefits of metapopulation here through a sort of confusing like sort of thought experiment. And the idea is, let's say this is not time any longer, but now you have some probability, that's with the P parentheses, you have some probability of extinction. And this is your patch that you have the probability of extinction for. All right, so that means that each time you have a 0.2 or 20% chance of going extinct as this patch. If you were to cut this patch in half, I'll make it smaller, and you had two separate populations now, and we still keep the same extinction probability. So the probability of either one going extinct is 0.2. At any given time, even if one goes extinct, so if this one, why would I make it black? If this one were to go extinct, I don't know why it also pastes. You would still have this one potentially non-extinct, right? So now the probability that both patches would go extinct in any point in time, at time t, is equal to 0.2 squared, or 0.2 times 0.2. And so I go over it in maybe a little bit better detail in the notes, but basically it lowers your probability of extinction. If we were to assume that that dividing the patch into two habitat patches doesn't also influence the extinction risk. So like I had one big patch before, and that one had a probability of extinction of 0.2. And then I'm assuming that when I divide it in half, that it maintains that same probability of extinction, which maybe is oversimplification, but basically it's a way to buffer, if we're willing to accept that premise, it's a way to buffer against metapopulation level extinction. And so it can actually sort of help persistence. All right, and now we're going to get into a little bit of how we approach metapopulations. So I'm just going to delete this. All right, and the original sort of classic model of metapopulations is the Levins model. This tracks, it doesn't track population dynamics, it doesn't track anything but the fraction of patches that are occupied. It doesn't consider space, right? So let's say this is our metapopulation here. The Levins model only cares about occupancy, which here, I think I didn't delete a patch, I just moved them around. It's still 1 out of 6. And so the Levins model tracks the change in patch occupancy, a function of two different things: the colonization rate, C, and the extinction rate, E. There, I highlighted it. So all patches are assumed to be equally likely to be colonized. Colonization rate is a constant value for all patches, so there's no spatial structure. Same with extinction rate. And all we care about is this N, where N is the fraction of occupied sites. It has some relations to like the logistic model or like some of the earlier population model. Or I say it looks like logical competition. Just whatever. It doesn't really, but basically we have this first bit, which is like determines the colonization. So it's like this is supposed to be like the sort of force of colonization, where you have some colonization rate times N, the number of, or the maybe not number, the fraction of patches that are currently occupied, times 1 minus N, which are like those that can be occupied. And so that's the rate at which new patches are colonized, the rate at which uncolonized patches are colonized. And then the extinction is just the patches not getting colonized, species leaving or dying, whichever. All right, and from this equation, we can start to get at equilibria, right? And so we can get at equilibria by setting dn dt to 0 and then solving for it. So how do we make this quantity 0? This quantity becomes 0 when yeah, when you have n equal to 1 minus E over C. Okay, so that's when that is the value. I don't know why I called it K. That was a little bit silly. It's not really a carrying capacity. It's just an equilibrium point where it's the optimal fraction of not optimal. It is the fraction of occupied patches given E and C in infinite time or whatever. It will eventually go to that. Cool. Hopefully that was a little bit less confusing than it felt. But basically, it's the balance between extinction and colonization that determine the equilibrium fraction of occupied patches. That makes sense. All right. Yeah, further, okay. And so this description of the system in terms of the equilibrium fraction of occupied patches can be used to set up a persistence threshold. And so basically, as long as this quantity is true, then the metapopulation can persist. If it's not true, the metapopulation will tend toward extinction, right? Which means if your extinction rate is bigger than your colonization rate, that's what this is saying, that your metapopulation will go extinct. Say that again. If your extinction rate is bigger than your colonization rate, you will go extinct as a metapopulation. Makes intuitive sense. All right. And so the Levins models, it's pretty classic. It's pretty sort of foundational to our understanding of metapopulations. But it's important to note how many simplifying assumptions this model makes. Like space is not considered. Differences among habitat patches are not considered. So like size or suitability of the patch, the spatial orientation of patches in the landscape. All patches are like equally colonizable, which is a big assumption. Nothing about the actual species persisting or being on the landscape is considered. No species traits, no like population growth rates. The only thing that matters is colonization and extinction. Yeah, which is, it's neat that this model is sort of still being used and still provides neat insight, but yeah, it makes so many simplifying assumptions. It's kind of cool. Yeah, and you can calculate useful metrics or measures from the simple model as well. And so you can look at the mean time that any patch would go extinct as the inverse of the rate of extinction, or the extinction rate E. And so we would expect that the time for this patch to become extinct is equal to 1 over the extinction rate. Yeah, there was a recent paper, I think it was from either 1 or 2 years ago, that showed that these stochastic patch occupancy models, which are more complex, they consider, so they incorporate stochasticity, and they also consider the spatial orientation of the patches. There's been some work showing that you can collapse those down basically to a Levins model. Like, so Levins style dynamics emerge from much more complex models, meaning it is actually kind of a still useful model despite these sort of litany of simplifying assumptions. Okay, so now we have our idea of metapopulations. We have an idea of what they are. Hopefully we have gone over this the original metapopulation model, which sort of ignored most of the metapopulation fun bits, right? Like the actual population dynamics in each patch, like, yeah, but we'll get to that. Now I'm going to talk about different types of metapopulations. I'm going to pull my notes over here just to make sure I've gone through everything that I did before. Yeah, I got to draw a lot more. This is hard to draw in, so I think I'll try to figure out a way to draw for you folks in class when we do more interactive things. Yeah. All right. So types of metapopulations. And here, oh, I did include the figure. Okay. So the different types of metapopulations can be broken up along two axes, where you have connectivity along the x-axis, where here on the far left, you have very isolated populations. And so dispersal between them is difficult. Okay, so there I drew it. I sort of moved these patches away to simulate that. And then meanwhile, on the right, you have highly connected, where dispersal connections are strong or patches are close together. And so dispersal is there. Patches are well connected. And then along the y-axis, you have variance in patch size. So when variance in patch size is small, as it is here, where all patches are the same size, you're down on this lower part. And then as you go higher, you have much more variance in patch size. Here you have one patch that's really big and then others that are quite small. And the types of metapopulations can be sort of viewed in this two-dimensional space. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. All right. In the middle, this sweet spot is like a classic quote unquote metapopulation. And then as we sort of move in other areas, we start to get into different territory. So as you, I can't highlight that, but the patchy panmictic and the dissected landscape are two situations where dispersal is high enough, where you're not seeing actual metapopulation dynamics. So here, dispersal is so high and the population is just present everywhere, such that all patches are occupied at some given time. And dispersal is strong enough to just basically make this one big patch. Even though there is some dispersal and there are dynamics, you're assuming individuals can disperse pretty much anywhere. So it's panmictic, meaning all mixing. And then the second one is the dissected landscape, where really this is just one big population that has like a road running through it, but it's not limiting dispersal such that like, yeah, it's a sort of extreme. And these two are sort of not metapopulations in the strictest sense. Really, I think I make this point in the notes, but I would argue that the only two like true quote unquote metapopulations are the classic metapopulation and the mainland island metapopulation. I'm not even sure if people consider that a metapopulation, but for the sake of this class, let's go ahead and consider the classic metapopulation and the mainland island metapopulations. And so as we go the other way, as you start to get more isolated and you have small, and you have low variance in patch size, so you have something like this, what you start to get at is what they call non-equilibrium. A non-equilibrium metapopulation, which is not really a metapopulation, because what's happening is each one of these patches here is basically its own subpopulation, where its dispersal is not really connecting them, right? And so, yeah, in order for it to be a metapopulation, it has to sort of qualify as a metapopulation. And there's a bunch of rules, of like sort of the original like Hansky and Oiskainen work, and like Sastermoinen and them. They sketch out far more draconian rules about what truly makes it a metapopulation versus not. So we're going to here use metapopulation maybe a little bit too loosely. That's an aside. And so the last one in this space is the mainland island metapopulation, which is basically just a sort of source sink metapopulation where you have one big patch that serves as the mainland and it distributes individuals through dispersal. And so notice that here the arrows aren't going from the small patches to the mainland. It's really that this big patch is just the source and then it sends individuals out. That's my hacky arrows that I'm just drawing and accidentally also pasting a circle there. I think it's a glitch. Look at this. Like I draw an arrow and it pastes a circle. Right? Inkscape. Get on it, guys. All right. Yeah, and the notes I go over the idea of propagular rain, the idea that from this mainland in the mainland island model that this mainland is basically just throwing individuals out, and some of them are going to land on these islands and stick. All right, and so we can look at the mainland island model as a special case of the Levins model, where we're still tracking the fraction of occupied patches, capital N, but now the colonization rate doesn't depend on the current. So before it was CN times 1 minus N, the quantity. But now the fraction of occupied patches doesn't matter. The only thing that's driving colonization is the fraction of unoccupied patches, because we're assuming this mainland population never goes away. It always is the source. And then that some the patches also go extinct at some rate, E, little e. And this changes the equilibrium, the equilibrium fraction of patches occupied to now equal to the colonization rate divided by the colonization rate plus extinction rate. Yeah, I'm going to talk about mainland island, and I think I may have said this already. It relates to the idea of sources and sinks. So the mainland is the source of many individuals, where a source population is defined as that having an abundance of individuals and a positive population growth rate. So little r greater than 0, lambda greater than 1, leading to population growth. A sink is a population that has a r less than 0 or a lambda less than 1, meaning it will tend toward extinction. But what's happening is something called the rescue effect, which I go over down here. The rescue effect is when populations that would go extinct do not, because of the influence of immigration. So this, let's say this patch in red has a negative growth rate with r little r less than 0 or lambda less than 1. It will go extinct. However, if you add in the immigrants that are being supplied by the mainland population, the population size can actually remain stable or potentially even increase. And so you can still have persistence of a population even with a growth rate that will tend toward extinction. Okay. And here I go into more detail on the other forms of the metapopulation as gone over here. So the patchy panmictic is here. So local populations exist, but patches are so well connected that interbreeding is, yeah. And here I draw that line in the sand. That's not a metapopulation. The non-equilibrium populations were those bottom left ones. Their populations are independent and their demographics are not linked. All right. Okay, and this rescue effect can be actually sort of formalized in the model. And it's formalized by taking the Levins model. So this model right here, where we had colonization rate is a function of the fraction of occupied patches times the fraction of unoccupied patches. And then extinction just occurs at some background rate proportional to the fraction of occupied patches. But what if we consider extinction to be dependent on the fraction of occupied patches and the fraction of unoccupied patches? This was the change that that Hansky, Ilka Hansky in 1982 incorporated to look into the rescue effect in closer detail. Yeah, but we're still actually only considering, we're still actually only considering the fraction of occupied patches. So we haven't considered space explicitly, and everything is still driven by colonization and extinction rate. And the balance between those two is the thing that sets up the equilibrium fraction of occupied patches and determines metapopulation persistence. I think it might have been in that paper, that 1982 paper. I'm not sure. But it's been posited that, like, okay, there's a fraction of occupied patches that is required at equilibrium, which means that if you were to remove patches, even if they're unoccupied, that you can fundamentally change occupancy patterns of the remaining patches. Okay, I try to show that here through equations, but maybe I should just like use silly little bubbles instead. I think basically the idea, and add some patches to this population, to this metapopulation. The idea is that if I have this network of patches, this metapopulation, and I remove, and so this is, let's say this is at equilibrium, and I remove these two patches, that now my occupancy is higher. And so my fraction of occupied patches is actually higher than equilibrium. So I'll be pushed back down, and that can actually, this actually can create a case where fewer now patches are occupied. So the removal of unoccupied patches can still change the metapopulation and the species dynamics, even though it's not utilizing those patches, these patches that were over here. How I show this sort of mathematically is I consider D, this new variable D, is the proportion of patches removed from the system. So now we have the classic Levins model where we have colonization rate as a function of occupied patches times unoccupied patches with those that we removed, or like that, I don't know, we built a gas station there or something, I don't know, as just a minus D. And so when we calculate the equilibrium occupancy, the fraction of occupied patches at equilibrium, we now have D in the equation, meaning this fraction of this fraction of removed patches, the number of removed patches, influences the equilibrium dynamics. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. I sort of explained that in two different ways. Hopefully at least one of those is clear. If not, we can go over it further in lecture. All right, and now we get some fun, right? So there's a bunch of different extensions of metapopulation theory away from this sort of classic like Levins model and stuff like that. And a lot of like sort of patch occupancy work has done a great job incorporating the spatial element more explicitly. But some of Hansky's work and Novoskyin's work early on, not early on, it was like the 80s, late 80s maybe, early 90s. Incorporated space more explicitly. And how they did that is they modeled dispersal as a function of sort of the species itself, sort of. Okay, it was less about the species and more about the patch structure, but like there's species traits sort of built into that. And what I mean by that is the idea is that larger patches will have larger population sizes. Also, we assume that the distance between patches influences dispersal. And so farther away, patches are less likely to be connected via dispersal. But what we're trying to do basically, like now we're actually considering variation in patches, right? That's a big step forward. We're considering the connection of patches explicitly. We're considering some coarse measure of dispersal, right? So we're basically assuming negative exponential dispersal, where this dispersal CI, it's also like I think it's defined, I think here as connectivity. Oh no, I'm defining it as colonization. All right, so the colonization of a patch, of patch I, is determined as a function of the, yeah, sorry about that. I have another project that I'm actually working at. It's related to some of this. It's whatever. Hopefully I'll edit this out. All right, so the colonization rate of patch I is proportional to the sum of all of those connections that are going into it, where the connections are proportional to this negative exponential dispersal linkages, where we have alpha, which we defined as, I don't think it's defined there. I think it's patch, no, it's not patch area. Oh, it's just the, I'll correct that in this. Oh, it's the dispersal rate. Yeah, so it's the modifier to the distance between patch I and patch J. And so that controls the shape of the negative exponential curve. And then that's timed, that's multiplied by the area of patch J times Pij, which I think is probability of dispersal, maybe. Where does it say? I'm going to clean this section up. Yeah. Yeah, but I think that makes sense. I don't know why it's a function of time. Probability of dispersal at time. Probability. It might be the probability that the patch is occupied itself is because you need that patch J to be occupied in order to contribute individuals. I'll go over that. Maybe I'll edit this or something. But yeah. All right. And I'm actually going to stop the video here to make editing this later easier. And then I'll finish up with a discussion of species area relationships and theory about biogeography in the next short lecture. Nice.